All right, so welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone. If you can hear me and raise your hand, I would appreciate it. That way I'll know if anyone hears me. Ah, fantastic. Okay, terrific. Okay, great. So I'll start with a full disclosure, and that is that the first time I heard about Queen Shlomtzion is where's the most likely place to hear of Queen Shlomtzion? If you like a good kosher restaurant in Jerusalem, there's Rehov Shlomtzion Amalka near the old city, and that had some very good kosher Chinese food. And it's I see some people know that had some great kosher Chinese restaurants and other restaurants. It's right near the walls of the old city, Rehov Shlomtzion Hamalka. But in terms of who she actually was, not many people know about her. And especially if you compare her to her sort of counterpart, which would be Queen Esther, another Jewish queen, the knowledge people have of Queen Esther is far, far greater than people have of Queen Shlomtzion. So today we're going to speak about Queen Shlomtzion, or as she was known in Greek, Salome Alexandra. The name Alexandra, for obvious reasons, was popular in that time, and she was the queen in the time of the Hashmonean Empire, and not empire, kingdom. Now, very important thing is to manage expectations. It's important to know that if you're a Hashmonean king or queen, the bar for righteousness is very, very low. Having read a lot of history of the time of the Hashmonai kingdom after the time of Hanukkah, they're not the nicest people, to say the least. They do many things that the rabbis don't like. We're going to talk about that today. But in general, the Hashmonaim do some brutal, brutal things. So it's important to note that when we say Queen Shlomtzion was an amazing queen, that does not mean she doesn't do some pretty brutal stuff. So just have that in mind. It's a time where you're going to see the bar for good behavior is very low. And so she's a great queen. She's amazing, but she does do some things that, in comparison to her other Hashmonai people, she's like Mother Teresa. But in today's standards, you wouldn't necessarily refer to her as the most gentle person in terms of how she reigned. So let's start. First of all, there's descriptions of two separate queens. There is in Josephus, the book of Josephus, there's a description of a queen named Salome Alexandra. And in the Talmud, there are fawning reviews of an amazing queen named Shlomtzion. How do we know this is the same person? Or is it the same person? So people usually assume it's the same one, but there's actually a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that puts those two parts together, so that we know that King Salome Alexandra, which is Shalom, is actually Queen Shlomtzion, that the Talmud absolutely loves. Like, she's very, very popular in the Talmud. We'll see why. But it's the same queen. So it's important to note that Queen Shlomtzion, Queen Salome Alexandra, has been confirmed to be the same identity by the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is a queen that lives in the, she's born around 120 BCE during the Hashmonai kingdom. And she's considered a great person, as her name indicates, because of exactly the shalom that she brings. During her time, she ends up being in power in various ways for decades, but she's an exclusive queen for 9 years, and those years are very, 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 very peaceful. Her sons, a lot of times you have great Jewish people, but especially Jewish women, and then the sons don't bring as much nachas as you would want. Her sons are the infamous two sons who go to Rome and ask Rome to take over Judea. We're going to speak a lot about them during the 3 weeks. So they give her a bit of a bad rep, but overall, she's amazing. Which family does she come from? So the Talmud tells us. Her brother is Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach. Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach is her brother. He's a known Tana from the Mishnah, and that is Queen Shlomtzion's brother. Seems great. She's also a queen, but also has yichus. Sounds good? Does that sound like a good combination? One problem. To be related to a rabbi in those days is a very bad thing. In fact, her first husband, Yehuda Aristobulus, kills every single rabbi that exists. So I guess in that way, it's good to be brothers. If you're a rabbi and your sister-in-law is the queen, it's a good thing, especially since if the king is killing all the rabbis. So her first husband, Yehuda Aristobulus, is a really, really, really violent person. He imprisons his mother and 3 brothers and then kills some of them. So it's important to understand what kind of environment she walks into. So she's in an environment where people are not gentle to their family members. There's always succession battles. And she marries a fellow named Yehuda Aristobulus. He does not like the rabbis. I'm going to shatter somewhat of a myth. If you study only Talmud, you get the impression of the Tzedukim as some kind of rebellious cult that shows up in our history. The Tzedukim are actually the mainstream. When Shlomtzion HaMalka becomes queen, the Tzedukim dominate the monarchy. The Tzedukim dominate the temple and the priesthood. The Tzedukim dominate the Sanhedrin, the high court. It is all controlled 100% by Tzedukim. So we sometimes speak of the Tzedukim as some kind of renegade bunch of rebels that come. No, they are the mainstream. And so the fact that her brother is this great rabbi doesn't help her a lot. It helps him, but it doesn't help her. And so she comes in, she's the queen, she's the wife of this person named Yehuda Aristobulus. I actually have a class online that I gave at the Jewish Center about the difference between the Tzedukim and the Prushim. But does anyone want to give an idea of what the political, religious differences are between? Just raise your hand, then I'll have you unmute. What is the difference between Tzedukim and Prushim? Anyone wanna share a perspective on that? No. Robert, no. All right, so I'll give if you do, you can raise your hand. I'll unmute you. So here's the difference. The Tzedukim believe in the Torah, only the literal part, not the Torah Sheba'al Peh. They also believe that Judaism is very dependent on temple service. They don't know a Judaism that's outside. The Perushim, on the other hand, which, by the way, if you're sitting here, you are probably a Perushi. You know, in some parts of America, I think like in the Bible Belt, if you call someone a Pharisee, that's a curse. Has anyone ever heard of the expression a Pharisee in a negative way? It's like considered a bad thing, I guess, of certain mentions in the New Testament and Christianity. But the Perushim are the ones who believe that Judaism is not only in the temple. Who do you think the people side with? Who do you think, who gets the popular vote in Israel? The Tzedukim or the Prushim? Anybody want to weigh in? Tzedukim or Prushim, who wins if there's an election?
The Prushim.
The Prushim. Why is that?
I mean, currently, I feel like that's who we are, aren't we? The Prushim, like we accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh, like we're the. Otherwise, maybe the Tzedukim because they don't require so much of everybody.
Good point, but that's today. But what if you have an election in the time of Shlomtzion? Who's winning? In the time of the Second Temple.
I mean, if they weren't following stuff, then I guess the Tzedukim.
So I guess, you know, like they say, it all boils down sometimes to taxes. So the Tzedukim are the establishment. The Tzedukim are the kings, the priests, and the Sanhedrin. And the people actually don't like them. They're not popular because they believe that the only way you can be religious or have any virtue in your life is by donating money to the temple, bringing sacrifices, and giving them more power. The Perushim are the sort of populist movement that believes in Torah, Gmilut Chasadim, and things that mean something to every person. So the Perushim are actually the popular vote, but they have zero power, whereas the Tzedukim are the everything power. They control everything, and they're the ones in charge. So Shlomtzion's first husband, Yehuda Aristobulus, does not like the Perushim because the Perushim are a threat to, it's almost like in Christianity, Luther, right? So the Perushim are a threat to the Tzedukim. So he kills every single Perushi rabbi. And he saves her brother Yehuda ben Shetach. Another very interesting point, her husband is not only king, but he's also Kohen Gadol. In those days, those roles were combined to the dismay of the Perushim. Nachmanides, in his commentary to the Torah, says that one of the reasons the Chashmonaim have been punished and gone extinct is because they violated God's commandment to make sure we have a separation of powers. You know, in America, there's separation of powers. So too, in the ideal world, there's a separation between Kohanim and kings, but the Hashmonai household does not believe in that. Really, the more you read about the Hashmonaim, please don't hold this against them too much, I guess. But they're really they're a violent bunch that takes a lot of, like, yes, latkes, and yes, sufganiot, and yes, everything, but the Hashmonai kingdom is a brutal one. And not only that, the credit we give them on Hanukkah for preventing Hellenization is exactly what they do one generation later. They are very Hellenized. Just look at all their names. Aristobulus, Antignos, all these names are very non-Jewish names. So basically, she's married to this guy, Yehuda Aristobulus, who takes his mother into prison, kills 3 of his siblings, and then he puts another one of his siblings, he keeps one out, and he gives him a lot of power. Now, I just want to give you an idea. I'm going to show everybody a map. I'm going to share it on the screen because you just need to understand what a prosperous time this was. Meaning, even though it sounds like the kings are very wicked, they're doing great in terms of the size of the kingdom. Take a look here. So this is actually, it's the largest size that the Jewish kingdom reaches during Shlomtzion and her husband's time. This is pretty big. In fact, they even had control of Damascus. So you can see how these kings, even though they're brutal, they really expanded Judea. Remember, this is Judea, not the kingdom of the 12 tribes. They do great in terms of like their military stuff. So that's the family she marries. Her husband is not home a lot. Why is he not home a lot? He's always busy during wars. He's always busy in conquest. Now, she takes advantage of this, and this is where her personality comes in, and she starts managing a lot of the domestic stuff. But here's a kind of a dirty play that she does. Her husband is very paranoid of being assassinated for a good reason. And he makes a law, and he says, anybody that comes into my court, into my palace with a weapon will automatically be killed. Now, here's where her dirty move comes in. She goes to his brother, who is kind of a threat to his authority and to her being the successor. And she says, you are such a hero. You conquered so much. I want you to come visit us with all of your weapons on you because you are such a great warrior. Her brother, her brother-in-law, Antignos, I mean, I've heard of some like nasty Thanksgiving meals, but this is a whole new level where she tells her brother-in-law to come and to be fully armed. And then her brother-in-law walks in and he's killed by the guards at the palace. So after her husband basically imprisoned the other options for kings, she has this one killed. And then her husband gets sick. And on his deathbed, he tells her, you're going to help the succession, and he dies. Now she becomes much more famous. Is everyone familiar with the mitzvah of Yibum, the one described in the book of Ruth? So yeah, so by now she's like well established. She does a lot of the domestic stuff, and she marries his brother Alexander Yanai in the mitzvah of Yibum. He is 13 years younger than her. He is 13 years younger than her, so it's a bit of an unusual situation. And she also manages by now a lot of the situation in the kingdom. He too, he's very, very against the Prushim. He's extremely against the Pharisees. And Shlomtzion has to deal with having a brother who's a devout Pharisee, and on the other hand, a husband that's killing all the rabbis. I believe that in Jerusalem, maybe someone here knows better than me, there's a street, Alexander Yanai, somewhere very central. Has anyone seen? There's an Alexander. Anyhow, she marries Alexander Yanai after she sort of orchestrates the assassination of her brother-in-law by telling him to come with weapons when the law is that anyone who comes with weapons gets killed. All right, we'll forgive her for that for now. And then she goes on to be the queen, Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai is also a very territorial king. He's not interested so much in what's going on domestically, and he goes and he conquers many areas. But he does oppress those who are his political enemies. Who are the biggest political enemies if you're a king at that time? Who are your biggest political enemies? As a group, as a party, as an ideology? I see we have here someone answering. Is that Naomi?
Is it the Nevi'im?
Well, they kind of like to think of themselves in this way, but it's the Prushim. So Alexander Yanai is very, very devoted to getting at the Prushim. And what he does is the following stories. If you thought you've ever seen a wild story develop in Shul, listen to this, or any Shul you've ever heard of. Alexander Yanai, who's a Tzduki, Tzdukim do not believe in the pouring of the water on the Mizbeach, Nisuch HaMayim, that we do on Sukkot. Now, Alexander Yanai takes for himself the position of both king and Kohen Gadol. The king / Kohen Gadol comes to the Beit HaMikdash on Sukkot when it's filled with people who frankly probably resent him and his taxes, and he does the service as Kohen Gadol, but he does it as a Tzduki Kohen Gadol. I'm going to tell you what the story mentioned in the Talmud is, and then I'll give you the Josephus version. The story mentioned in the Talmud, it doesn't speak of Alexander Yanai, it speaks of a Kohen Gadol, a Tzduki Kohen Gadol. The Gemara in Masechet Sukkah says, there was once a Kohen Gadol who did not believe in Nisuch HaMayim. He poured the water on his feet to avoid pouring it on the Mizbeach, and it says that all the people in the Beit HaMikdash threw their etrog fruits on him and killed him that way. He was, is anyone here good with the language to tell me? Because I don't know what the verb, I know you can say someone was stoned to death. I don't know if you can say someone was etroged to death. But anyhow, the Gemara tells this story where the people in the Beit HaMikdash all throw their etrogs and the Kohen Gadol dies. That's one version. There's the story in Josephus where Alexander Yanai does the service improperly. Remember, he's the king and the Kohen Gadol. And people start throwing their etrogs on him, and it's sort of a rebellion. At this point, he starts a indiscriminate murder of people, and he kills many, many people, obviously associated with the Prushim. Now, we speak a lot about the Jesus Christianity being crucified as something that the Romans did. It was actually more of the what we would call minhag makom. It was more of a local custom. Why? Alexander Yanai, remember, this is 100+ years before the whole story with Christianity. Alexander Yanai crucifies 800 Prushim in front of their families. Very cruel, very brutal, very grotesque. And he murders many thousands more. And he expels all the other Prushim that he can, and then he kills every rabbi that he can. So again, very, very, and this is true of all the Hasmonean kings, very repressive, very jealous, very paranoid, and they kill many, many, many Jews. And that's what Alexander Yanai did. Now, the Gemara shares the following story, very interesting story. The Gemara says, one day Alexander Yanai finished eating and he wanted to do Birkat Hamazon. The problem is there's no benchers, that's first of all, so appreciate the benchers that you have. Number two, nobody knew how to bench. It says that nobody knew how. Can you imagine that? The king wants to say Birkat Hamazon, and in those days, someone would make Birkat Hamazon for you, but there was no one who knew how to bench. And his wife, Shlomtzion, says, I know, it's like an illegal substance, right? She's like, I know how to get someone who can bench, but I need your promise that you will not kill that person. So Alexander Yanai says, I won't kill him if he comes to bench for me. Good deal. So she invites her brother Shimon ben Shetach to come out of hiding, and he benches, and they have this conversation there, Shimon ben Shetach and and Alexander Yanai. And that's one story that the Gemara shares about Shimon ben Shetach and Alexander Yanai. It's like this tense relationship where the king kills all the Prushim, and the queen Shlomtzion's brother is sort of a Prushi leader. There's another very interesting story that's shared in the Talmud that kind of shows the tension, and by tension I mean absolute animosity, between the Prushim and the Tzdukim. The Gemara in Sanhedrin shares the following. Can a king come to court? And I guess this relates now to multiple countries that have cases of presidents, prime ministers that are under investigation or in trial. Is a king, can you try a king in court? So the Gemara says that Malchei Yisrael, a king of all of Am Yisrael, cannot be tried in court, but a king of Beit David can be. But then it says they decided we will not do that anymore. Why? Because there was a case of Alexander Yanai where his slave killed someone, and that means he has to come to court. And he said, you know what? I'm going to listen, and I'm going to come in front of the Sanhedrin. What problem do you think what might happen when, especially a brutal king comes in front of a court system? What can happen? Any problem, any potential problem with that?
Kill the
Problem
judges.
is, sorry?
Kill the judges.
Exactly. So Shimon ben Shetach talks the talk. He says, Alexander Yana, you are not above the law. Please come right in front of us. And he comes, and nobody says a word. Nobody dares to say anything. And he says, you know what? From that day on, he decided Melech, and that's when the Gemara says, Melech lo dan velo daninoto. You cannot judge a king because it becomes a joke. He shows up in court and nobody is willing to testify. That's one story that the Gemara says about Yanai HaMelech. Another story that the Gemara shares in Kiddushin, which is very in line with the type of person Yanai HaMelech is, it says that he goes to conquer 60 cities, which he did. He conquered many, many cities. He comes back and someone says to him, you shouldn't be serving in the Beit HaMikdash. You're a king. You don't need to be a Kohen Gadol. And that's when he kills all the rabbis. And it says that there was no faith. There was no one who can teach the faith until Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach revived Judaism. So basically, she's married to this guy who's very brutal. But Shlomtzion takes the opportunity when he's on war, and she does kind of try and appease the Prushim. She is considered a woman of the people. People come to her with their cases, etc. And she's increasingly popular. What happens? As you can expect, if the king is very into wars, eventually he gets killed in war. So actually he gets sick. Yanai HaMelech is on the other side of the Jordan. He's on the eastern side of the Jordan during one of the battles. And she comes to visit him and he's deadly ill. And I don't know, this was probably more strategic of hers than an actual situation that came up. But she cries to him and she says, how can you ask me, now that you're about to die, to go back to Jerusalem when you're so unpopular? Everyone hates you. And if everyone finds out that you died, I'm dead as well. What advice do you think might be a good piece of advice? She's a widow. Well, she's not a widow, but he's about to die. And he's extremely unpopular. Remember the 800 people he crucified in front of their families. What should she do? How could her kingdom be strong? Anyone have political advice for upcoming Queen Shlomtzion? She's about to be queen. She's married to the biggest villain, most hated person in the country. And the question is, how can she become a king in a favorable way without fear of retribution from the people? The second they hear that Yanai died, then they'll kill her. Any political advisors here? Anyone want to advise Queen Shlomtzion on what to do? Yeah, Robert?
Maybe she spreads the story that she's the one who killed him.
You know what? That's a good one. I didn't think about that. That's a good one, right? She says, she comes victorious. I killed my husband. But at the same time, in general, you see that with David and Shaul. You don't want to, even when you come in as a king, you don't want to be the king who killed your predecessor because then someone kills you. But what he tells her to do, and remember, there's still two sons. They have two sons. What he tells her to do is keep my death a secret. I guess this is before social media. So he says, keep my death a secret and do not let my two sons succeed me. They're not strong enough. You'll be my successor. Go back before you tell anybody that I died. Speak to the leaders of the other party, the Prushim, and tell them they are in charge of a lot of the domestic matters. And that's what she does. She comes back to Jerusalem, back from the other side of the Jordan, and she doesn't tell anybody that her husband died. She comes to the opposition party and she says, you guys have not been treated fairly enough. Let's let you guys be the deciders. Now, does anyone now understand why she is such a hero and why she gets such good reviews in the Talmud? Well, she handed the keys to the rabbis, right? She comes over to the rabbis and she says, look, from now on, you guys are in charge. Now, It kind of reminds you of certain situations where the guy leaves his will to the synagogue and suddenly, everyone speaks about how righteous he is. So the rabbis say, oh, great. And then by the time he dies, well, he died already, but by the time she confirms that he's that he's dead, the rabbis make a great funeral for him, and they're like, okay, great guy. All the anger is gone. So basically, it's a smart move on his part. She plays it out brilliantly, and she's like, okay, my husband died. The Pharisees are in charge. Now, who might be unhappy? So first of all, now you just understand why she has such a great place in our tradition. She's the one who basically sidelined the tzdukim. She hands control to the prushim. Another very brilliant thing that she does, and I think that's something that many political situations can be solved with. I don't know if religiously this is the best advice, but she creates a mixed Sanhedrin, a mixed court. She says, until now, the court was 100% Tzeduki. Now it's going to be sort of 50-50. I don't know how she tied it in terms of like conservative, liberal, or what the exact number breakdown is, right? There's 71 people in the Sanhedrin, but she basically says, you have to bring the Prushim into the Supreme Court, and that's what she does. So she gives a lot of power to the Prushim. Another thing that's solved with her becoming queen, and remember, this is the first time Jews have a queen, I believe, in our history since Devorah, right? You have Devorah, who's a judge in the book of Shoftim, but in terms of like a monarch, Queen Shlomtzion is our first and I believe last monarch. You have Izebel in the time of Achav, but she's not a monarch, and she's definitely not seen as a good person. So just to pause this class for a second, just stop and think about that. Queen Shlomtzion is the only queen that we have had, and that in and of itself is very worth noting, very important. So Queen Shlomtzion gives the Prushim a lot of power. She is actually, in her personal life, there's like all these testimonies of religious things that she does, and she has all the rituals done according to the halacha. She brings them in. But another problem that's solved is you don't have the double role of the Kohen Gadol and conflict. I guess people had no problem with her being queen, but Kohen Gadol, that was not on the books. That was not something that would be an option. So there's no problem, right? The Prushim are really angry when a Kohen Gadol is also a king. Well, she's a queen, so problem solved. She's the queen, and her son, who's also named Aristobulus, is the Kohen Gadol. So that problem is also solved. So you can see she's solving a lot of problems. She's also great with diplomacy. She's a great diplomat. She keeps the size of the empire. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question here about what the difference is between the Tzedukim and the Prushim. So I'll quickly repeat that the Tzedukim believe only in the literal, what's written in the 5 books of Moses. They do not believe in any rabbinic tradition. And more importantly, in the context of that generation, the Tzedukim believe that your Judaism depends on membership in the temple alone. The only way to connect with God is by bringing sacrifices. The only way of paying tribute to God is by donating to the temple. And there's really nothing besides for that. It's similar to the pagan nations that are in those days. The Perushim believe in a more individualized liberal Judaism, where the Prushim say, no, your Torah that you study, the chesed that you do, the tzedakah that you give, all these things are your Judaism. You don't have to go to the temple and pay taxes in order to be a good Jew. Obviously, that's something you should do, but that's not the main point. So that's the difference. And she hands over a lot of power to the Prushim rabbinic Judaism. So she keeps a lot of the laws of purity, and she gives a lot of power to the Prushim, and she keeps their mitzvah, the halacha, the way the Prushim do it. Another thing that she does is she separates the institution of Kohen Gadol and king, which is a dream come true for the rabbis. And then she also... I'm going to talk a second about the question. Are Karaites descendants of the Tzedukim? So this is a very important point. The Tzeduki ethos of only keeping what's written in the Torah in some way came to an end when the temple was destroyed, meaning yes, there are tzedukim today, but there's nobody today who says your Judaism is 100% dependent on what happens in the temple in Jerusalem. There's that became a non-option after the destruction of the temple. But remember, in the ancient world, all religions depended on a temple that was local. And what's amazing is that without the Perush, not to give a shout out to everybody here, but without rabbinic Judaism and the Perushi version of Judaism, there would be no Judaism after the destruction of the temple. And in fact, the Passover Seder that we do, the Passover Haggadah, is very much the peak of Perushi literature, because it tells you, you know what, you will not bring a Korban Pesach, but you will still have rituals. You will still keep this mitzvah. And that's the beauty of rabbinic Judaism, is that it allowed Judaism to survive beyond Jerusalem, beyond the temple. It allowed for Judaism to become a more universal religion. By the way, that's why it's kind of bizarre that Christianity is founded on the premise that the Pharisees are the bad people, when in fact Christianity relies in so many ways on rabbinic holidays, on rabbinic ideas, on the idea that Judaism is not limited to temple service. So it's kind of tricky to place Christianity in all this, because Christianity is not temple dependent. It relies on much of the Prushim, but it just rejects the idea of binding commandments altogether. So that's another, the relationship of Christianity and the Prushim is another conversation. But so that's why the term tzedukim here is tricky, because it's not only people who believe only in the written Torah, but it's people who believe only in the temple service. It's people who do not see a place for Judaism that is not connected to the temple. And it's very convenient for them to believe it, because the tzedukim in those days are the government. They are the establishment. They are the Kohanim. They are the kings. They are the Sanhedrin. They have everything. And so Shlomtzion really is a woman who transformed Judaism and history, because she brought in the Prushim into the mainstream. She gave them positions in the Sanhedrin. She made sure the temple service was compliant with their beliefs, which are the popular vote. It's beliefs of the people. So in that sense, she's really remarkable, and therefore she deserves all this credit that she gets in the credit that she gets in the Talmud. Now, we like to think of the Perushim as the righteous rabbis, the ones that are the people of the masses, which is true in many ways. But you have to ask yourself, with every minority, with every group that's sort of the underdog, wait, what happens when you become in charge? And so when the Perushim become in charge in the days of Shlomtzion, they kind of become emboldened and they start killing the other people. This is actually setting the mood exactly for the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av. So basically, the Perushim start persecuting the Tzedukim, especially the Tzedukim that crucified 800 Perushim in front of their families. And so then the former Tzedukim, the loyalists, the royalty, the aristocracy, come to Shlomtzion and they say, wait, we were so loyal to you. We were like your husband's best friends, and now you're throwing us to the wolves. And once again, she comes up with a brilliant political compromise. What do? On the one hand, she's pleasing the Perushim. Good. That's a great political move, because they represent the masses and they're the underdogs and they're the people you may see a rebellion from. But on the other hand, you have to please the aristocracy, the establishment. So what do you think she does? Any other political strategists here? What do? How do you not only bring the Perushim in, but also keep the aristocracy, the establishment happy? How do you do that? Anybody? Any great political theorists here? What do you do to keep them happy? So she sends them as ambassadors, as diplomats. She sends them to be in charge of cities. Basically, she sends them out of Jerusalem in an honorable way. She gives them, okay, you'll be in charge of the city of Tiberia. Tiberia didn't exist yet, but you'll be in charge of this or that. And that's how she sends them to all kinds of places and keeps them out of Jerusalem. Everything's very, very good. To understand how fierce the battle between the Tzedukim and the Perushim were, there's a story in the Gemara in Chagiga. where it says the following. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai, it's actually a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai says, I killed an Eid Zomim, a witness that was lying, just to make a point to the Tzedukim. So Shimon ben Shetach, the brother of Shlomtzion, says, well, you killed someone innocent. But you see from here how fierce the battle between the Tzedukim and the rabbis is, and how Shimon ben Shetach, even though he's a Prussian, the head of the Prussian, he's like, wait, you can't just kill people. So that's the battle between the Prushim and the Tzdukim, and that's where she really steps into domestic events. Another important question is what about her children? So has anyone heard the story of the two children who were like debating each other who's going to be king, and then one went to Rome to, I think his name was Pompeius, and he brought Rome in. Nachmanides mentions it. Basically, there's a question of succession. And that's really the biggest question about Shlomtzion's legacy. Shlomtzion's legacy is amazing. She's a queen that was a queen for 9 years, from the year 76 to 67 BCE. And she keeps a huge territory. She's a great queen. She brings the people together. She synthesizes the opposing parties, Tzedukim and Perushim. And she really keeps the people happy. She has diplomacy that wins. But the question is in terms of succession. She has 2 sons, and both are not great options. And one of them, in his fight, goes to Rome and says to the Romans, why don't you guys come? I'll let you control everything, and you'll make me in charge. So that's the question, and a lot of people blame that for the destruction. I'll speak about that in a second, if Shlomtzion deserves hate for her children's bad behavior. Spoiler alert, probably not, but we're going to see in a second. Now, interestingly, there's a story recorded in the history of a country that is not on anybody's mind at this moment, I believe, and that is there's a Armenian Empire, and the king of Armenia, his name is Tigris. He comes to war with Israel, and he takes Damascus, he takes the whole northern part, and she comes to him with a huge amount of gold and silver and diamonds, and she's like, here's a gift to you, please leave us alone, and he leaves. So it's another symbol of her avoiding wars. Unlike her 2 previous husbands who were very much men of war, she is a woman of peace, of diplomacy. She leads with diplomacy, and she avoids a war by bribing him when he comes to the city of Akko. 2 very important things that the policies, government policies that came into place during her time. Shimon ben Shetach, her brother, has 2 laws that he establishes that we keep until today. So you can see from here sort of who she is based on the laws that her brother was doing, maybe on her behalf, maybe just because he thought it makes her happy, maybe unrelated, but still good laws. One is the law, this is very progressive and forward thinking, the law that children have to go to school. Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach makes a law that if you are a child, you need to go to school. And so I just saw a study today, when you let women make policy, there's like all these successes that they come to in terms of like measurable successes in policy. And this is a great policy. She makes a law that children have to go to school. The other law that Shimon ben Shetach makes that is noted in the Talmud is he makes a law that the ketubah, the salary, the alimony that a woman gets is something that all of the man's property is committed to. So every time a ketubah has to be paid, the man's assets are committed to paying that. So that's another thing that happened. The Talmud records her time as one of the most prosperous times. I'm going to read to you the words of the Midrash about her, and you'll see how missed she was by the rabbis later. It says, Bimei Shimon ben Shetach u'bimei Shlomtzion. In the days of Shimon ben Shetach and Shlomtzion, you see, by the way, how the 2 are recorded as sort of, they weren't married, it was a brother and a sister, but they were the people in charge. It says, Hayug Shamim Yordim Beleilei Shabbatot. It used to rain on Friday night when everyone's home, meaning nobody had to miss work because of bad weather. And it also says, Ad shenasu chitim kiklayot. It says that the size of the wheat was the size of a kidney. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration because I don't think the stock can hold up a grain that's the size of a kidney, or maybe it's a certain animal kidney. But it also says seorim kegar inei zeitim. The barley was the size of olives, the adashim kedinare zahav, and the lentils were the size of golden coins. And it says that they held on to some of this for future generations to show. Basically, her time is recorded as a prosperous time, a peaceful time. Her name is Shlomtzion because maybe actually it's the opposite. Her name was Shlomtzion and she brought peace. Shalomtzion, she brings peace. Even in English, in Greek, her name is Salome Alexandra. So she's a woman of peace. There's an extraordinary amount of prosperity in her times, and she's remembered in a very, very positive way. The biggest blemish on her legacy, and now I'm going to see if it's her fault. The biggest blemish on her legacy is her two sons. So her sons, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus, fight about who's going to be a king. Aristobulus is the stronger one; he dominates, and the other son goes to Rome. And by now the Greeks are out. And he's like, why don't you guys take over, make me king? And that's when, according to the rabbis and many, that's when Rome takes over the small independent kingdom of Judea. That is the end of Judean independence. And that's when Rome starts controlling us, and many hate them for that. Question to the audience, opinion question, because this is something that's debatable, very much so. Josephus blames her for her weak sons and the terrible succession. Is it her fault or not? Anybody want to weigh in on this question, whether he uses really strong, well, two things Josephus criticizes for. Number one, he criticizes her for succession. Number two, he says she gave too much power to the Prushim. She let them manage all the domestic affairs. And also, in a way, he's right. He says that the Prushim were there to take the credit, the salaries, and the honors. But when things got messy, they handed it back to her. And so he's not a fan. Anybody, does anyone want to give a perspective if it's her fault that her sons had such a terrible succession battle to the extent that one of them goes and calls Rome and he's like, okay, you take over Judea, and that is the end of Judean independence, the beginning of the end and the beginning of Roman domination. Should we give her a hard time for that? Anyone? Any arguments one way or the other? No one's going to judge her. No one's going to vindicate her. We'll leave it as is. So I if you do, you can raise your hand. I saw different interpretations of this, but one person was saying, look, it's ridiculous to assume that the Roman Empire, which was becoming so great and dominant, would have somehow spared Judea and been like, oh, you guys are managing your internal affairs great, we're not going to touch it. Rome took over the world. And so to say, yes, of course, it's not good that one of her sons called Rome and said, hey, make me in charge and you guys can take Judea. But on the other hand, to believe that she, had she done a better succession plan, Rome would never, ever come to Israel is just ahistorical. So that's the argument that I saw made. I see... this is a very good question I got here. If Yanai knew, by the way, if anyone wants to put questions in the chat, you're welcome to. If Yanai knew that cooperation with the Prushim would bring peace, why did he not do it earlier? So the Prushim were a threat to his control, which is why he killed so many of them. The Prushim only made things work for her because she gave them over control over internal affairs. But in general, the Tzedukim were the establishment, right? So it's like the landowners in Europe. It's like the aristocracy in Russia and in England. So the Tzedukim are the rule of the landowners, of the aristocrats. And so Yanai understandably doesn't want to give it to the Prushim. Prushim are more populist. They are more populist, by the way, not in a negative way. They represent the majority of the people. They represent less power for the executive. They say you don't have to do everything through the temple. You don't have to do everything through taxes and giving korbanot. And so they decentralize power. And Yanai is someone who wants a lot of the power. And so he, by the way, if you read about Yanai, I don't know how he got a street in Jerusalem because I don't know. He got a big kingdom, but not a nice man. He was not nice to our people. If anyone has other questions, you can. In the meantime, I'll quickly show a few slides about the rule. So again, you see what a huge, absolutely huge kingdom this is. There's a palace near Jericho, her winter palace. I don't know if anyone feels like this is an appealing winter palace, but if it is, if you do feel so, feel free to be jealous of Queen Shlomtzion's palace near the Hasmonean palaces near Jericho. That is a mountain called Sartava, which is very important when we learn about the Hashmonai kings, because like Masada, the Herodian, and other places, they always make sure to have a quote-unquote winter palace, which often is actually a fortress. In case there's a coup, they can run to the fortress and reestablish their kingdom, which did happen with Herod and Masada. Yeah, this is a place called Sartava Mountain, and this is also where she hangs out in the winter. Here are just a few names of books about her. Queen Salome, Jerusalem's warrior monarch, the 1st century BCE, Jerusalem's queen, and Queen of the Jews. So yeah, it is very important. She's really the only queen we had, right? Because you have Esther is the queen, but she's not the queen of Judea. She's the queen of Persia. And so Shlomtzion is the only queen we had. Overall, I would say she's a very good queen. She's a very successful queen. And the only thing we can hold against her is her 2 sons, which is not necessarily her fault. Here's if you've ever been to Jerusalem, Rehov Shlomtzion Amalka, there used to be some great kosher restaurants. I'm sure there are still some great kosher restaurants there, but I can't make any specific recommendations. And that's it. Here are the years that she ruled. If anyone has questions, comments, here's a very, very good question. How did the rabbis in the Talmud in Yoma 19b place the words, the etrog stoning? The etrog stoning. This is a very tough question. I can't really answer for it because okay, a few things, a few important things. The story of the etrog stoning in the Talmud is a story of victory to the Prushi side. It's like the Kohen Gadol did it in a way that was not popular with the people. The people threw etrogim on him, yay us. But if you read the historical account, it's actually a horrible tragedy, because Yanai then goes on to kill thousands of Jews in Jerusalem. And so it's a really, really horrible story. So I don't know that I can speak about the reconciling these two situations, because he did some horrible stuff. It's interesting. There is one statement I know of in Pirkei Avot by Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach, and it's very relevant. It says, Shimon ben Shetach Omer, Hevem marbel lachkor et haedim. Make sure you investigate the witnesses many times, Shema midvarach elmedu leshaker, because they may learn from you how to lie. This ties into Shimon ben Shetach being reformer of the Sanhedrin, and it also ties into the episode where he tells someone you should not be killing a witness just to prove the tzedukim wrong. That is the story of Queen Shlomtzion, who was not only a successful queen for 9 years, she was the first Jewish, what's the word for monarch and female? She's the first Jewish... It's also monarch. Okay, so she's the first Jewish female monarch, and she also, during the time of her 2 husbands, both the Aristobulus I and Yanai the king, she is very much in charge of domestic affairs. She's very successful. She's very popular. Her name is Shlomtzion, which means shalom, and she brought peace to our people. And the only tragedy I can think of is that her sons were much worse, but she's a great woman. She's definitely deserves more notoriety. She did great things for our people, and she presided over the greatest commonwealth we had in the Second Temple. That's it. If anyone has questions, comments, great. Otherwise, I think we are set. No? All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Very much.
And if you go to Jerusalem, make sure you stop on Shlomtzion Street and go to one of the restaurants there. They're very good restaurants. Do not go to the restaurants on Yanai Hamelech Street. I'm joking. That's also probably as good. But Yanai was not a nice guy like her. All right. Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good to see everybody. Hey, Susan,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, Deborah, Malcolm. Have a good week.